Today I'm going to give a quick overview of a few things. We're going to talk about how climate change influences agricultural production, and the food security community calls that availability of food. There are sort of four pillars. Availability is the first. We're going to talk about how climate change may influence economic access to food. We'll talk about the utilization of food, which in this case, I'm going to use food safety as an example and its relationship to climate change. And we'll talk about the stability of all of these elements. I'll also touch a bit on how businesses may be thinking about this sort of thing and other kinds of decision makers, because in order to ensure food security, you really need to consider all of these things, and you need to factor in climate change. So let me show you what I mean. In 2010, lots of things happened. A couple that were important from a food security perspective were the drought in Russia. It's the brown spot on the map. It was the worst drought they'd seen in 50 years. It affected a quarter of their wheat growing area. 2009, production was about 97 million metric tons. 2010, it was 70. And as a consequence, global wheat prices spiked that year. At about the same time, in Pakistan, they had severe monsoonal floods. A fifth of the country was underwater, most of its agricultural land. This is in a country where 60 million people were already considered food insecure, and this is an example of how these kinds of events can cause issues with the viability of farming as a living. It can create urban migration and can create greater reliance on markets for food and prices associated therewith. So these are just spots on a map. These are just singular things that are happening. Now the effects for the people living in those spots were quite profound, but they also rippled out, even out to the global scale. So it's important that we notice that. So we know that climate matters because we've seen it matter in the past, and we have reason to anticipate that climate change will make events like these more common in the future. Let's look at temperature. This chart goes back 1,000 years. It could go back 10,000 years, and it would look very much the same. Basically, we stay within this very narrow range of variability throughout that time period. Even the medieval warming and the Little Ice Age are just blips here. They don't really get outside that range, which is to say that agriculture came to be in a period of very stable climate. And it's existed within that range this whole time. Now, the red, you can see the observations. We sort of popped out of that range, and we are seeing effects on agriculture. So this is where we are, and we're seeing the effects. This is where we're headed. So we're already seeing effects on agriculture, and we have reason to believe that those effects may accelerate. What are the effects? We talk about them in terms of direct and indirect effects on production, things you probably know about like temperature, precipitation. There's this carbon dioxide fertilization effect and extreme events. They play a direct role. They influence production, yields. They also influence things like weeds and insects and disease and fire, which in turn affect production. And we think that their effect may be on the same order of magnitude as the direct effects, but they're not as well studied. Economics and trade are they have a different quality, but the point here is that a farmer in Talbot County on the Eastern Shore or Iowa is very aware of what's going on the other side of the world, and that information causes them to make different choices when it comes to production and management of their crops. I would be remiss not to mention livestock. Livestock is also affected in a changing climate through their sustenance, through the production of milk, meat, and eggs, and also through animal health. Obviously, this is a really thin overview, but I don't want to get Sunshine mad at me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw to this report, which USDA produced last year, and you can distribute, which gets into these biophysical attributes in depth. This is a summary of that same report. If you'd like a physical copy, just give me your card and I'll be happy to send it to you. It is online. So So there's that. So it's worth noting that farmers are very adaptable. Never underestimate the ingenuity of a farmer. But climate change does impose new challenges that are outside of our historical experience. Now, existing adaptation strategies can help offset many, probably not all, effects up through mid-century. But beyond that, given the acceleration, we would expect to need new strategies, new tools, new practices in order to compensate. It's also worth noting that some adaptation is easily deployed and inexpensive. Other types of adaptation can be quite costly and require capital investments, and not every producer is necessarily going to have access to those resources. So, for example, production is going to move around. It is moving around, and Africa is one example of that. These are data on corn. Basically, the finding here was that for every day during the growing season, that it was 1 degree, for every degree every day over 86 degrees Fahrenheit during the growing season, corn production was reduced by 1%. That was if there was enough water. It was every day, every degree. So if there wasn't enough water, it was reduced by 1.7%. So basically the finding of this paper was that 65% of African agriculture was affected under adequate precipitation conditions. Under drought, 100% was affected. I'm often asked if there won't be compensation at higher latitudes for changes like this. So let's look at that. This is Russia again. Temperatures become amenable to wheat production 600 kilometers further north than they are now under these projected changes in climate, which potentially opens up a lot of land. So why am I showing you maps of shortfalls in Russian grain production? Well, what happens the further north you go is the soils become far less suitable and ultimately unsuitable for agricultural production at scale. This happens in Russia, it happens in Canada, and the southern hemisphere, there just isn't a lot of land at high latitudes. So you can't grow at scale further north in Russia. In the south, they expect more drought. So the yields where they're already growing wheat end up getting reduced. So maybe you can nudge things a bit north, but large increases in production at higher latitudes are not expected to fully compensate for the losses seen at lower latitudes, particularly beyond mid-century. So we've been talking about this availability part of the food system, of food security. I'm going to talk a little bit about food access. So food security, it's about growing food, but not exclusively. It also includes the concept of the means to acquire food. So as the geography of production changes, costs change. The more of something you grow, the closer by, the cheaper it is. If you're growing less of it, if it's being grown further away, the more expensive it is. So at that point, you have a choice. You can pay more for the food you want. You can pay the same for perhaps some kind of substitute that would be cheaper and more easily grown near you. Or there's the possibility that you just have less access to food. And the gentleman asked the question about the cultural ramifications. Food is one. Food has social, cultural value, and there might be some choices in there. So climate change affects what you can afford and how much of it. And that's just a trade-off that needs to be managed by those of lesser means. So the third pillar here of food security is utilization. We could talk about food waste, for example. I'm going to use the example of food safety. So once you have food available and you have access to it, you can buy it. The question becomes, can you use it? Things like typhoid, Campylobacter, and aflatoxin-producing funguses have a demonstrated link to climate and are expected to continue to increase in prevalence and affect food safety. For our marine friends, fisheries are also affected. Algal blooms can be very serious from a health perspective, and there's one particularly toxic variety that has an annual growth cycle of 68 days that's anticipated to go to 259 days. They're huge shifts. In the North Sea between 1981 and 2002, there was a tripling of the frequency of algal blooms due to increased sea surface temperatures and related climate factors. So that's a real concern for those folks. And I'm going to move on. Okay, so the final concept here for food security is the stability of all these things. So I'm going to show you real quick the underlying stability of the climate system. What this here is a distribution of summer temperatures in the 1950s. The white strip would be a normal summer. The red part would be a hot summer in the 50s. The blue would be a cool summer in the 50s. So as it moves forward, you're going to see through the years, all of this has moved to the right. There it goes. And so what would have been a hot summer in the 50s is now a normal summer for us. And a normal summer from the 50s is a cool summer for us. And a cool summer from the 50s is unusual and would be a very cool summer for us now. So the underlying conditions for production are changing. This can create volatility in food markets, which influence access, and also it influences food safety needs. Things, when temperatures go up, you need to think more about packaging and storage and things like that. So those are concerns as well. Now, business and decision makers, Coca-Cola came out recently, among others, saying that climate change represents a strategic threat to their ability to do business. Companies tend to hold this information pretty close to the vest. There aren't a lot of scientific peer-reviewed publications on this subject, but there are some interesting hints, so I'm just going to touch on a few of those. So when you change the geography of production, you need to change your infrastructure. So, for example, as the ideal growing region for corn moves northward with temperatures and encroaches into what was traditionally wheat territory, just knowing that corn is 4 times as bulky as wheat grown on the same area changes your transportation needs, changes your storage needs, changes a lot of things underlying all of this. There may be a shift in terms of different kinds of transportation. If you're not growing near a water access, that may shift transport toward rail, toward trucks, and potentially away from waterways. There may be shifts in ports in terms of which ports are actually being used more. The Mississippi, the New Orleans port may not be used quite as much as maybe some of the more northern ones. There might be a shift there. There's a seasonality of consumption, and I think this is a little intuitive. In the summer, we tend to like lighter, fresher food. In the winter, we want heavier food. With changes in seasonality under climate change, there may be a shift in demand for certain kinds of food. At the same time, it becomes more important that we have safe storage, but high temperatures increase stress on the electric grid. So it becomes more expensive, it becomes more subject to disruption, your storage. So food types that rely on continuous cold chains may see more expense, may see more challenges, and similarly, just-in-time logistics, which is a system where production and distribution basically happen at about the same rate as consumption of products, so companies don't have to maintain big and potentially climate-controlled storage facilities. Given potential disruptions in transportation systems, just-in-time logistics may need some consideration as well. These are just hints. It's not something we know a lot about now. It's something we're just starting to look at. And in fact, because of that, USDA has started looking into these questions. And we are producing a report due in fall of 2015. Happy to talk with you more about it. I brought a flyer. It has my contact information. And I'm happy to talk with you about it. But it is a multi-institutional. We're talking with federal authors, NGOs, industry, international academics, national academics, just people from across the gamut to try and get at some of these questions. So that's where we are. I'm happy to talk with you about it. So it's very complex, but I think the complexity also offers us some hope. There are lots of management tools in here, and there are lots of points of intervention in these systems. So a development plan can be an adaptation plan. A transportation plan can be an adaptation plan. Research, conservation, all kinds of information extension. They can be adaptive if you're thinking about climate change when you do your planning. So it's not hopeless. So I am gonna, okay, I have 0 minutes, so I'm gonna wrap up, and thank you for your time. Thank you for inviting me. Just to highlight the main points, climate change does affect all 4 elements of food security. We're already seeing the effects of climate change, and we have reason to anticipate that those effects will accelerate. There are shifts in production, but increases in some areas are not expected to fully compensate for losses in other areas. And given the changing geography of production, challenges to transportation systems, increasing costs for refrigeration, things like this, strategically thinking businesses and other kinds of decision makers are taking climate change into consideration when they do their planning and operations work. So there are a lot of sectors intimately involved in the food system, and climate change plays a role in a number of them. Which is my final point. So if you're going to deal with food security, you do need to be thinking about climate change. And thank you.